Hi, everybody. Hey, here's Chapter 10, Introduction to Batch Files. Okay, let me go ahead and start by sharing my screen. So let me get to command prompt. Okay, so batch files, okay? Batch files are the precursor to programming in the operating system, okay? Ultimately, your goal, if you're going to go beyond this class, whatever, would be to learn PowerShell. Now, I know that CIT40 does cover some PowerShell in that class. PowerShell can be its own course in and of itself, okay? Because again, PowerShell is the programming language of the operating system. And the cool thing about PowerShell is that it's becoming more OS neutral in that, you know, a lot of the Apple people, a lot of the Android people and stuff, and Microsoft people and stuff, a lot of times PowerShell kind of comes into play, and they like kind of going back and forth between the various programs, okay? So anyway, but hey, this is a precursor. This is a batch file. This is just a sequence of commands that you want to execute one line after another. You know, up until this point, you have had like 9 chapters of independent commands, okay? Now, if you said, hey, I want to do a series of these commands, I would put that into a batch file, give that batch file a name, and then execute that batch file, and it'll execute each line of code one by one, okay? That's the kind of the basics of it, okay? So if I start off here, the simplest way to make a batch file is what we call with the copy con, okay? So copy from the console, so let me get up here, click on this thing here. So I'm in drive I where my student data is at, copy from the console, and I'm going to give a file name called, let's see, markback.bat. Now, BAT is a very special extension name. It's called for a batch file. So the name of this thing is going to be called mark.back, and whenever I want to execute it, I just have to type in mark.bat. If I want to, I can put .bat, okay? And then whatever I type out there is going to be part of that file. So press enter, and it says, what do you want to do? I think the first thing I'd like to do is I would like to clear the screen. Great. What else would I like to do? I would like to do a directory on wide view. Fantastic. I would then like to say, give me a directory of the /music /CIT40 /mark folder. Okay, and let's say that's all. So then I'm going to do a Control-Z or function 6 and do a dir and see if I got this new thing called, what was it? Markback.bat. So we're going to look into the M's, right? Where is it at here? Let's see, I'm in drive I. Okay, here we go. Mike. Okay. Let's do dir mark back .bat. Oh, okay, so it is. Okay, so mark.bat, okay, is here. Okay, if I use the type command or the more command, mark back.bat, okay. Okay, it'd be nice if I can spell back, B-A-C-K. It says, oh, look, clear screen, dir-w, and be a directory of that one. So what if I want to run it? I would just simply type in mark-back. Again, I'm going to put the extension just to be nice for now, but it's not required. It's kind of like .com or .exe. As long as it can find that file name, okay, if it knows, it recognizes that's a command file or it's an executable file or a batch file, then you don't have to put the 3-letter extension. But I'll do it this time. It doesn't hurt. Okay. What did it do? It cleared the screen. What was the second? So it did the what was the second thing it did? Okay. It said, give me a directory in wide view. Hey, it gave me a directory in wide view. Then it said, give me a directory of the subfolder mark, which is under 40 under music. Remember the way back when? That was the word.back file that I moved over there or copied over there. Okay. So it actually did what I wanted to carry out. Okay. Now, because it was a copy con, because it was a copy from the console, it's like a tape recording. Once it's recorded, you can't really edit it using the copy con command, but you can edit it using the Notepad, an editor. So if I said Notepad, mark back, gotta make sure I spell it right, .bat. In this case, I do have to put the extension. Okay, now I'm not sure if this screen it worked as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing and then reshare the screen and make sure that I can see the Notepad file. Okay, because the screen sometimes doesn't always do it. Okay, there we go. And now I can see I'm in the notepad, okay, up here. And maybe I want to put in a remark, REM, and say this was created by Mark Forestier, and REM, it was created on, you know, in CIT40 at Fresno City College. So I just put in some remarks, a kind of internal documentation, okay? At the end of chapter 10, your group, you're gonna have to make some batch files. Let me go up there and fix that capitalization, CIT, because that should probably look better if it was a T. There we go. You're gonna have to create some batch file where you have to put some internal documentation, okay? You'll have to put your names or whatever, or the groups or the descriptor or something like that. And please, please, please don't cheat and use somebody else's from another version of this class. If somebody took a last semester or the semester before, they're gonna have different names. So if I find that you use somebody else's names in those batch files, whatever, then the entire study guide is going to be a 0 for everyone in the group, okay? Because there's no excuse for that, okay? So when you're doing your batch files, I don't need to have you actually give me as a working batch file. Just, you know, give me the text version that you see here. So when you type it out, you could just type it out in Word. That's fine with your study guides. You could just scroll down and say type it. I can read and know, like I'm reading here in Notepad. I could sit there and say, oh, yeah. 3 remarks, no problem. It was supposed to clear the screen, directory wide view, and directory this one. I can read that and understand what that really means, okay? I don't need the actual file attached for it. Just type it out in the clean text and stuff as you're answering that particular problem set 1 task, okay? So this problem set 1 is going to have you create some of those things and stuff, and then you're going to be able to answer the questions based upon that, okay? So Notepad is a place that I can actually look and edit things, whatever. Now, when I run the file, okay, you notice back up when you looked at the screen and stuff, it had what was called echo is on, meaning that I could actually see the execution of the command. So let me close this part out here, okay? Oh yeah, I probably should save that change with those remarks, sure, okay? And then again, sure, okay, no problem. I'm gonna share my screen again. There we go, okay. So when I ran the file, remember the first thing I did, it cleared the screen, but then it said, what was the second thing? It said, do a dir/w. What was the third thing? dir music CIT40, right? So it was echoing the commands. If I don't want to echo, there's what's called @echo or echo off, okay? Echo off means don't show those kind of responses from the computer. Don't show the user what you're doing. @echo, the symbol, like at Fresno City College, that A with the circle, okay? That means don't even show the command echo, okay? So again, I can go through and put some stuff in. So let me go back and re-go into my notepad again. Okay, here we go. And then I'm gonna reshare my screen. So hold on, I know, stop the share and share again. Oops. I wanna make sure you can see it. Okay, so if I don't want anything to echo, now REM commands won't be echoed, they're default, they're like internal documentation. So I can either put it here or I can put it down here, it doesn't really matter. But it's good to sometimes put your remarks up the top. Then I'm gonna say @echo. And the cool thing about echo is I can do echo off and echo on and echo off and echo off and on and off just by saying echo on space, echo off, right? And I can turn it on and off throughout the entire batch file. So if there's something I do want the user to see, then I can say echo on, let them see the echo, what's being talked about from the computer system, and then right afterwards I can echo off. Now a lot of times when we boot systems up, okay, a typical OS company and stuff will have echo on, so people can actually see that it's booting. Now, it's a certain security violation because if you can see what they're doing, you might be able to break that batch file, okay, and bypass any kind of security protocols or anything they may have placed in place because you can actually see what's happening and look for the breaks, okay? So it's actually a good habit to not allow the user to see your batch files, except if it's a long batch file and it takes a while and the clock or the circle is spinning or the hourglass is tipping over or whatever and stuff, what happens if the people wait too long? If they don't see something on the screen, they think there's something wrong and they have a tendency to want to reboot the system. So if you're going to have an echo off, you might want to put a message in with that says, please wait, this could take 10 minutes, even though it may only take 30 seconds. People love it when it said 10 minutes, but it was done in 30 seconds. So just lie to them and stuff, but makes them feel better, okay, kind of thing. So at echo off, okay, you can also do what's called a pause. So let's say that before I came in here, I put in pause, okay? So I can say, oh, clear the screen, right? Then do a dir/w, then wait for the pause, meaning that at that point, the program will pause. I can press any key to continue, and then it does the last part of this command, okay? So let me go ahead and resave this file. Great, with those changes, okay? And then I'm gonna close this out. Yep, I gotta have to reshare the screen again, hold on, okay? This time I'll use the more command and say, what is, you know, the more markback.bat batch file. Oh, see all the remarks? Fantastic. Now I want to run it. How do I run it again? The actual file name, back.bat, right? Cleared the screen. I don't see the echo. See, it doesn't tell me what it did. It didn't tell me it did a directory/w. That's the echo off. I have a pause. Now, again, I could turn off that press and key to continue, but that helps me know what to do. And what comes after that? Oh, that's when I wanted to see the directory of the mark folder under CIT40. So if I press any key to continue, I see the rest of it. The batch file is complete. I've now gotten all the way to the end, okay? So remarks and pause and echoes, all in batch files, pretty simple processes. Now, again, I did mention about file extensions. There are 3 file extensions that you should always be aware of. Your book talks about them briefly in this chapter, which is .com, command file, .exe, executable, and .bat, batch files. All 3 of them could have the same basic file name, but have a different extension. And because they're unique extensions, meaning that com, executable, and batch are unique, they don't require you to type them in. So if, let's say I had 3 file names, one called startup.com, one called startup.exe, and one called startup.bat, which one would execute first if all 3 of them, okay? The general rule is if they're all 3 in the same location, it'll always execute the com file first. So if it saw a startup.com and you typed in startup, it would ignore the other 2, the executable and the batch file, and it'll always execute the com one. If it doesn't have a com one and there's just the executable and the batch, then it'll execute the executable version, the exe one, and never execute the batch. Okay, so there's a sequencing in there that's very important. So what that means is that if you're not sure if you're going to have multiples like that, then when you want to execute the command, don't use the shortcut of not using the extension. Type the extension, because if you say I want to run startup.bat, it doesn't matter if there's a startup.com or a startup.exe, it will run your startup.bat file, okay, because you are very explicit in that process, okay. So the last thing is that when you look at the chapter and stuff, the batch files and stuff can have what are called variables, or parameters that you can pass into a program. Okay, and so you can create a structure around a batch file that allows you to say I want to use a like a math X, Y, and Z. Okay, so let's see if I could do this. Let's go back to Notepad. Let's do a new one. Notepad. And what could be a new file name? Let's say I'm going to call it dir sort.bat, dirsort. Okay, not sort, sort.bat, dirsort. Fantastic. Yes, I can't find them, so yes, I want to create a new one. And I gotta stop my share and new share and get you back over here. Dirsort. Fantastic. Okay, great. Now, let's say that I want to do a directory, and I'm not sure which directory name I want to use, so I'm going to put %1. Okay? So that means now, that's like putting dir xyz, x, a variable. And then whatever's going to be in %1 is going to be the directory name. Okay? And it's going to put it in that process. Now, let me save that. Cool. And let me go ahead and do a new share back to my screen again. Okay. Okay, great. And then maybe I'll use my more command again, and I'll say dir sort.bat. Oh, there it is. Okay. Now, how do I feed that? How do I feed in that variable X, right? So let's say, remember I have that folder called music. What I want to do is I want to run dir sort.bat, and the very next thing after a space is I'm going to put in \music. And now I see the music folder. I never typed in the actual command. I typed in dir sort, and I fed \music. Here it is. It doesn't say %1. It says dir. Look, yeah, there you go, \music. Okay. So it fed it in as a parameter, as a variable. So I can have multiple variables. I can have %1, 2. Actually, you can have from %0 all the way to %9, a total of 10 of them. %0 is when you want to call another batch file. That's not used very often. But think about it this way, is in mathematics, our most common 3 in math is X, Y, and Z. Well, hell, man, now you got %1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, %9, right? You got 9 X, Y, Z, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, so on, okay? That you can have 9 different variables. And they can stand for part of a command. They could be a file, a folder, whatever it may be. Again, when you execute that, like up in here, you launch the file. In this case, it was dir sort batch. And then each parameter has to be spaced apart. So if I had %1 and %2, I would have what? dir sort.bat space \music space \data. I don't know, whatever, okay? The first one would be %1. So anywhere it found the %1, I mean, much like anywhere it find the variable X, it would put in \music. If I saw %2, okay, then anywhere with the %2, it would put that next one in, which would be that \data or something like that, okay? So that's what we call passing or replaceable parameters, okay, in that process. And your book spends quite a bit of time. Now, again, this is not a programming class, so I want to make sure, because if you go on and take a look at your book in chapter 11 is going to go much further into programming. But the reality is that once you get the basics of the batch file, rather than going more into the programming using this process of this book, you should go get into your PowerShell. Okay, because that's the real powerful programming language of Windows or of the operating systems. Okay, so I just wanted to give you a little bit of an introduction as you look at those that chapter here in chapter 10. Okay, again, what's in chapter 10? Okay, it's introduction to batch files. We talked about using CopyCon. We talked about using Notepad. Okay, you had things like putting in some basic commands. You had remark statements, which is internal documentation. We had that echo on or off. We have that pause option, okay? I talked a little bit about the different extensions of .bat, .com, .exe, and the order of preferences or whatever, okay? I talked about replaceable parameters like X, Y, and Z's, only they don't call them X, Y, and Z's, or %1, %2, %3, and so on, okay? So as you look at, the book is pretty wordy on this one in this chapter. They give you a lot of screen captures where they'll say, do a directory of this and delete this and whatever and stuff. And you could pass a single character in, like if you wanted a variable for putting the letter yes or no in, right? Then you can pass just the letter Y, and everywhere where %1 was, it'll put the letter Y in. And so there's ways to feed in answers to a command or to a batch file, even down to a single character, okay? Thing about batch files is that one of the things that you can do is when a batch file is running, you can do a Control-C to break it, okay? Or Control break. Okay, a lot of us, when we're doing startup routines for security purposes, if we want that batch file to run and we do not want the user to be able to break it, we run an additional command at the beginning that disables the keyboard input. So while this way, we basically say is no keyboard can be accepted, no mouse can be accepted for input while the batch file is running. Then once the batch file is running and it's finished, the last thing we do is reactivate the mouse or reactivate the keyboard, and the user's back and going. And this way we don't have the ability, we deny the ability of the user to break the batch file in the middle of that security run or that batch file routine, okay? Anyway, so I hope that kind of helps. Again, a good introduction, okay? Gives you a basics. A lot of screen captures in this chapter 10, okay, for this one. You're gonna have some problem set 1 programs where you have to write 4 or 5 programs. Just type them out in the word processing document. You don't have to actually run them, as long as you got the text in correctly. A lot of it's just basics of it, and you should be able to pull it more academically because I can read the programming language to see if it's actually done correctly or not, okay? So you don't have to attach additional batch files. Just put the batch file text into your word processing study guide homework, okay? And that'll help out, you know, for me to understand that, yeah, I think you're getting the point across, okay? So anyway, batch processing can be done. Documentation, most programmers hate to do internal documentation, the remark statements, but their boss makes them. Why? Because that programmer may not be there tomorrow. And the next person we hire in, it gives them a leg up to know what the program is supposed to be done and when it was created, and any kind of internal things. So for instance, if you did use X, Y, and Z, and X really referred to hours that a person worked, Y referred to the rate of pay, and Z referred to their gross pay, a programmer might like using X, Y, and Z, but they better have an internal documentation library that says X is also known as hours, you know, worked. Y is also known as rate of pay, and so on, okay? That's the part that programmers is like, I know my program, and why do I care about the next person? Well, guess what? You could be the next person. So part of it is why the boss will sit there and require a review to make sure you are internally documenting your program. And that's just one example of internal documentation. Companies will go to a great deal of actually documenting snippets, pieces of code to what is this code trying to do and what is it accomplishing, okay? Not just a library of variables, but gives you kind of an idea to go through, okay? Anyway, I hope this helps. Let me go ahead and stop sharing here. Here we go. And I'm gonna end my recording and do this.